Okay, so what I had been saying before we decided to start recording is one of the reasons I don't play Starcraft very much anymore is it's very hard to play and maintain your skills. It's very mechanically demanding to the point where if you only play, and this is my experience, if you only play for 5 or 6 hours a week, you're actually going to get worse. I found that I had to play at least 7 to 10 hours to even stay as competitive on the level I attained. Um, and with a game like Grey Goo or Company of Heroes, it's a lot more memory. It's a lot more reactionary, I guess. You're able to react and kind of wing it a little bit more and still
Yeah,
be
there's not like
successful.
you don't have like 14 hatch, 14 gas, 15 spawning pool. Like you, there's no like
I
that
think
precise build orders where if you mess up, you die.
I think
Like,
Grey Goo has the potential to get there, but I don't think anyone's playing at that level in the game.
mm,
I'd love to see more people play, but it's really not. I mean, you can kind of just wing it for the first 15 minutes, and then so long as you're not drastically behind the other player in
mhm.
terms of economy, you're fine.
Well, and if you
Um,
think about it, like in StarCraft and in both StarCraft One and StarCraft Two, you in the Korean scenes, you would see pros who would purposely move their workers to the closer mineral patches, and it made like a difference of like 1 mineral per minute, but they would it's those minor adjustments that you would see in a mechanically demanding game like StarCraft that
yeah, and I think you
you
still
would see in Grey Goo as much. Maybe I'm not as experienced as you are.
can see that in StarCraft 2. I've seen, good lord, it's been forever since I played. I
Oh
don't
yeah, in StarCraft Two,
Idra
it's
people.
very true.
In fact, that's when I was at my quote unquote peak. I would do the same thing. For the first couple workers, you try to hit your worker where the other one is just leaving, so you've only got one worker
Yeah,
under your own
exactly.
hatch
And
at a
then
time.
and there's like the extractor trick, where you build your drone into an extractor and you build an extra drone and then you cancel the extractor so you get that extra supply without having to build
And
your.
and I know we have topics and we're going to talk about those, but that is actually one thing I think far too many RTS don't do. Is you In StarCraft there are so many ways to be good and to be better that you don't see in other RTS. In other RTS, a lot of things are very binary. Like if you look at, and this is probably not a good example because not a lot of people have played it, but Servo, you
Mhm.
have they've recently introduced an economic unit that boosts the output of whatever resource patch you put it on, and the only consideration is how many of them you build. There's no way to make them more efficient once you start putting them on the extractor. Or Grey Goo is another good example as far as economy goes because I could build a refinery at one end of the map and an extractor at the opposite end of the map,
Mhm.
and it'll automatically produce free harvesters until you get the promised rate of income. If it's 10 resources per second, it'll build harvesters until you're getting 10 resources per second. It might take
So
a little more.
it has that built-in kind of production for you in
Right,
that
and
sense.
there is room for nuance, both with micro and with macro in Grey Goo, but StarCraft just has bucket loads more than any other RTS.
Yeah, and
Um,
it's probably why it's so much more robust and why it's seen as such a higher skills ceiling and floor. It's because of things like extractor tricks or like how you arrange your workers or things like that. And there's the optimal production of workers is like 16, but you can still get minor differences between 18 and 24, and it's like depending on what you want to do, it can totally shift how where you put your workers or how many you have. It's a level of complexity that even at a gold or a platinum level, the mid tier players don't need to deal with because it's a mechanically more thing that you don't either understand or need to do.
yeah, and I personally wonder if that is either A, something that older RTS, and I'm thinking of Age of Empires,
Hmm.
that series here too, and you've played it more recently than me, so maybe you can comment, or if it's that people aren't giving newer RTS enough time to discover intricacies like that. Like I
That's
said,
a
I,
good
I
point. I
feel
hadn't.
I feel like Grey Goo has some surprising depth that only a couple players occasionally glance the surface of, and that has led me to wonder if it's not most RTS have things like that. It's just people aren't committing enough time and energy to discover them, or if you see an older game like Starcraft or Warcraft 2 or Age of Empires 2,
Hmm.
and those games just had more of that built in for whatever reason.
And I do think the older model RTS, the traditional style, I guess you could say, of resources and building bases and things like that, are generally more robust than something like Active. Well, Active Aggression is actually a good example of an older style, but I do think that's a good point because Grey Goo's a good example of that because they hired Huck, who is a professional StarCraft 2 player, to kind of stream their game and kind of advertise. And
Which I
he
thought was
played,
awesome. I watched almost all of his streams.
yeah, and they were, he in terms of pure mechanics, I think he's probably one of the best people to ever play Grey Goo. But because he was so new to it and didn't understand the mechanics, even in probably the 100 games he played, he was middling at best. Just because like you said, he didn't have time to figure out the intricacies of the macro and the micro, in a sense that he has the skill to pull it off, but he may not have the intelligence of the game to do it. And I think that's a
Yeah,
good point of like you need the experience in the game to find like, oh, I could do this and become better. And you don't get that till your 999th game or something like that.
yeah, and it may not even be just quantity of games played. I think it's you don't have that day 9 mindset of okay, I'm only going to build this one unit. What can I do with it? Or
Hmm.
I'm not going to push out for the first 15. I think day 9 was a large part of why the StarCraft 2 community became so um, interested to learn, interested to, and I'm not discounting the pro players, but I think
Oh
he
no,
reached
I
out and
I
he brought
100%
that
agree.
mindset to the average gamer. I remember games in the Silver League when I started out in Bronze and I started working my way up. And in the Silver League, I remember playing games with people and they were like, "Oh, good win," or "Hey," and it was a good game even though you lost. And hey, do you want to do some custom matches because we're about the same skill level? And I'd drop off the ladder and I'd go with this random person and we'd just do custom matches for an hour
Hmm.
just to practice again. Oh, hey, I want to try this build. Can I? And I've never talked to them before. I've never talked to them since.
Oh yeah.
Never talked to them before, and it was just I've never experienced that in another RTS. And I think Day 9 was a lot of the reason that people would do that
I
because he brought this positivity and this playfulness almost.
and honestly, in my opinion, he's the greatest video game person of like the past decade, because so many people know him who don't play StarCraft, or when they play StarCraft, they're not competitive. Like, I didn't know there was a competitive StarCraft 2 scene until like 2012, but I had watched Day9 for like 3 or 4 years,
Yeah,
just because I watched Newbie Tuesday and Fun Day Mondays
I
consistently. I never watched his pro analysis because I didn't think I was good enough, but I loved Fun Day Monday and Newbie Tuesdays.
I don't remember how I got into it, but I remember the first commentators I stumbled across were I think his name was he went by Psy Starcraft and Husky back when they were
Oh,
first.
Husky, yeah.
I watched Husky for a very long time. I don't even think he's doing StarCraft anymore, even though it's
He
still in his
when
name.
he doesn't do much anymore of anything. His YouTube's pretty dead, but he did about a dozen or two Legacy of the Void casts when it first came out in alpha, and they got like 300,000 or 400,000 views. So he obviously is still an influential character.
Yeah, I think he's producing the Nerdy Nummies cookbook, and I don't even know what that means. Like producing a cookbook, I'm not sure what that's all about. But when he tweets, it seems to focus on that a lot.
Hmm.
But we're getting far afield from even the very rough outline we'd drawn up. So I think what you had wanted to talk about was good mechanics, bad mechanics, and what might just be unsuitable for a game. And I think that's a really interesting topic. And I'd like to actually talk about that a little bit. So do you want to introduce us to that?
Yeah. So a lot recently, I've been obviously with StarCraft 2 Legacy of the Void expansion coming out in less than a month. A lot of discussion has been about the new units and like what's what I mean. Obviously, online, anyone if you don't like something, you call it bad design. It's just a cop out way to do it. But I've talked to a lot of people who are obviously intelligent and understand the genre pretty well. And um, one of the things they talked about is StarCraft 2 having hero units, in the sense that it's a very powerful unit centralized in one place, and they referred to the Mothership Core as that kind of hero unit. And it was an interesting discussion to me, and they called it bad RTS design, and that bothered me because a lot of great RTS games have had hero units or super powerful units in a limited number in in RTS games before. From Supreme Commander to Warcraft 3, obviously, it's one of the better games to involve hero units. And to me, that was just an interesting topic. And I tried to point out examples, and he's just like, nope, it should never ever be an RTS because he felt it took away from unit control. And so for me, I was trying to think of other ideas of um, topics that people have brought up that say, oh, that's just bad RTS design. It should never be an RTS when they're only applying it to one game. And another good example of this is Blizzard has been doing a lot of feedback with Legacy of the Void's release. And one of the things they tried out was similar to Supreme Commander's automated production, like you can do 4 ranged and one shorter range unit in Supreme Commander, and you can just constantly produce it.
Do that indefinitely. I would actually really like to see that in Starcraft.
And apparently they tested this, and apparently they said we don't mind the mechanic, but we just felt it wasn't Starcraft. It didn't fit in the game.
I can see that. I would be very hard.
That was a very conflicting thing because a lot of people are like, that's a bad mechanic. It should never be an RTS. And some people are like, no, it's an okay mechanic. It just doesn't belong in this game. And other people are like, I would like it in the game. Like you would say, you like to try it out and see what happens.
Yeah,
and that was a big one for me, is an example of what works in one game may or may not work in another, but it doesn't mean it's bad design.
I think it would be very hard to make that work with Zerg, and very hard to make that work with Protoss infantry, because
just because of the production style
of the production model,
Larva and gateways.
Yeah, it just doesn't fit with the batch style production on demand, because you're not queuing up production out of Larva, and you're not queuing up production out of a warp gate. It's on demand. Grey Goo actually does that. I don't take advantage of it because I don't.
I didn't know it did that for the first week I played it.
Yeah, I still don't use it. I've seen players do it, but I'd rather be in more direct control of my unit composition. And oftentimes I will go back to a factory and cancel a bunch of units, and then pick different ones as I add attachments and stuff. But yeah, I actually want more information about your friend's assertion that hero units shouldn't exist in RTS. Do you remember why specifically he said that was was a bad RTS mechanic? Because you said, a lot of RTS do that.
I guess his biggest reason was he felt like power centralization. It's actually Jack Attack. Do you know who that is?
Yes. He's a StarCraft 2 commentator.
Yeah, he commentates, but he mostly does a lot of research into design and the numbers of games and things like that. And he's been a big part of making StarCraft 2 feel more fluid in combat and things like that. And
if I can interject briefly, my experience with people who are very, very firmly wedded to one game is that they view everything from the lens of that game. So,
and I think StarCraft 2 is the only RTS he spent a lot of time with. So that probably does play a role.
I know people who are big fans of not necessarily Company of Heroes 2, much like many StarCraft 2 players kind of prefer Brood War. But I know a lot of really hardcore Company of Heroes guys that just Company of Heroes, that style is the pinnacle, and they define a good RTS by Company of Heroes. And a lot of people who fell in love with Supreme Commander, that was their first RTS. They define a good RTS by Supreme Commander. And I don't know if it's a blessing or a curse that I don't think that way, but
I'm the same way. I guess I played too many that I don't care.
So, because even in the realm of Blizzard, they've done, obviously Warcraft 3, they've had hero units. So I see his point. I think that's a fairly narrow view of what a hero unit is and can be. We saw in Warcraft 3, you did have actually Dawn of War 2 is probably a good example of that as well. You have a hero unit that can be immensely powerful, or it can just have localized buff and debuff effects, or zone control.
Yeah, they can be support damage, or offensive or defensive. Yeah, exactly like you're saying.
Or look at technically the commando units from Command and Conquer are hero units because you can only build one of them and they have unique effects, but they have definite downsides such as fragility.
If you look at Supreme Commander, the commanders themselves, they can be buffed up to be fairly decent fighting units, and you can be powerful unless they blow up and then they nuke your base. But
Yeah.
that's a downside.
Yeah, I'd almost consider experimentals in Supreme Commander more of the hero type units, but even that.
And some of the later ones, the early ones can be mass, but you're right. Some of the later ones are very like it takes one, and that can be a huge sway of a battle.
I just think the scale of Supreme Commander makes that comparison a little.
Well, and that's one of the things that struck me most is going back to say like the production style. In Supreme Commander, you can have automated production because it's such a slow game. In Starcraft, I wouldn't want automated production because it's always evolving and changing. Like I need Marines now, but I might need Marauders in 25 seconds when, Stalkers show up out of nowhere, and I need that anti-armor.
Yeah, and I think Terran are probably the only faction that could get away with it because you end up producing so many Marines and Medevacs
and just the production style is so standardized, I guess you could say.
Yeah,
I'm doing quotes in the air. And and I wouldn't mind trying automated production on one race because StarCraft is so asymmetrical that I feel like you could get away with making Terran macro or production more automated if there was a nerf somewhere else, obviously.
Yeah, well,
but I feel like it would be an asymmetrical difference in their race versus a balance issue.
Yeah, and I think if you maybe added that, but added something, I don't know what, to Zerg and Protoss, it would make it seem more balanced. But I could actually see automated production as Terrans being a two-edged sword. It would be great for low-level players, but I don't even think high-level players would even use it.
Well, and that's actually kind of... have you played Protoss and the New Legacy of Void much?
I have not in the past couple patches. I probably haven't played Legacy of the Void in
So the new Chrono Boost they added is actually... you don't cast it yourself, you place it on a building. And it just goes and goes and goes and goes on that one building forever. But you can move it if you want to.
But it only affects one building at a time.
And so, each command center can power one building at a time.
I actually really like that.
And so it's really good for new players, so they can just place it on their commands or on their Nexus and keep getting faster probes. Whereas an experienced player can say, okay, I don't need probes, so I can move it to my forge and get upgrades faster. And so it's good for the new player, but it also allows the skilled player to still experience the flexibility they needed.
Yeah, I really like that. That I think is very good game design. So far we've addressed kind of the two mechanics really, I guess, which would be automated production and what was the other one we talked about?
Hero units.
Hero units. So I actually have another one, and tell me what you think about this. Camera. It's like the number one complaint in RTS games is the camera's too close. Now,
unless it's Supreme Commander.
Supreme Commander, and I think so. Yeah, Supreme Commander spoiled us all. To me, and I'll use Company of Heroes 2 as an example. If you how much you can see is a design consideration.
I actually love that. I was just thinking that.
Okay, I thought you might disagree.
Great minds.
We might have finally found something we disagreed on. Now, I do think you see this in active aggression, where you have kind of a fairly close-in camera due to the size of the buildings more than anything, and then you've got that kind of zoomed-out radar mode. I don't know what the official name for it is. I can't remember. But you have two different visual modes with different disadvantages. I mean, I can understand, like, going back to Battle Realms or Warcraft 3, it does feel kind of claustrophobic to have the camera so low. But I think for something like Company of Heroes 2, Relic wants to force you to move your camera around and be active. It forces you to engage in the match.
And I really agree with that because if you like, I watch a lot of StarCraft streamers and Company of Heroes streamers, and one of my favorite things is when they're in the middle of the battle and they scroll just a little bit to their left and they're like, oh no, and they see an army that they didn't notice before because it was just off screen. And I think it's 100% a design decision because it forces players to express that awareness, the map awareness, and if you just made it zoom out, the players wouldn't be surprised. I mean, I don't think I've ever been ambushed in Supreme Commander. Maybe once or twice by an error.
Right, or maybe by a very, very lucky Cybern player.
Yeah, and so it's just like, there's no surprise. That's one of the things, and I understand. I'd like, it'd be nice to play StarCraft way zoomed out, or Company of Heroes way zoomed out. But the fact that there's such micro and positional games, I think it really benefits from the fact that you need to constantly be aware of your surroundings.
Well, and one of my go-to examples for Company of Heroes is those really super long-ranged, devastating artillery-style units
Oh yeah.
The I can't think of a good
Yeah, Company
the
of Heroes, I can't
elephant
remember the name,
the
but it'll like
elephant
wipe out like a whole
for
half the
the
map,
for the
half your screen will die.
for the Wehrmacht, the elephant, basically one or two hits everything but heavy tanks. Um, Being able to hit with one of those guys, or the Jagdtiger or something like that.
I can never pronounce their names. I'm not even gonna try.
um, those units, I think intentionally you're forced to kind of scroll around the map to use them effectively, because getting them too close to where you don't have to scroll the map to attack with them
Hmm.
is inviting getting killed.
And it's one another reason
It's a
why
balancing factor for the unit.
yeah, and it's one reason why I like units, not all units to be like this, but I like units who have range greater than their vision, like Siege Tank in StarCraft 2, or the artillery in Company Heroes. You could still fire into Fog of War, but
Well,
it's better. It's obviously better when you can see.
I'm not even talking about range greater than their vision. I'm talking about
Hmm.
range greater than the player's vision.
Yes.
I think it's a very good mechanic to have an artillery unit that's got a very short sight range to require a spotter. I think it's almost an inspired mechanic to have a unit that requires the player to be more engaged to use. And so an artillery unit that has a range longer than your screen can see
Hmm.
is a very interesting design challenge. It's a very interesting challenge for the player
Yeah, and
to have
obviously,
to perform.
StarCraft and Company Heroes are both very positional and micro oriented, but StarCraft, I think, even nukes and things like that, their range is still like one screen, whereas Company Heroes is like a screen and a half, two
Well,
screens,
and
which I think is a good.
this actually makes me want to bring up Servo, because Servo doesn't have a fog of war.
Oh yeah,
Yeah,
I've only watched a few videos. So I'm not an
they
expert.
show you everything on the map, so you can always see where your opponent is. You can always see what they're doing. What
Hmm.
you can't see directly are the attributes of your opponent's servos.
Hmm.
And roughly, you could think of a servo as equivalent to a hero in Dota or something, but
Yeah.
um, it's almost in some ways more than that, and in some ways less, because of course it's not gaining power through its actions. You have the kind of the concept of the ages from Age of Empires. You have an S-Con level,
Hmm.
or Servo-Con. The higher it's a play on DEF-CON,
Yeah.
obviously. And as the Servo-Con level, the S-Con level increases, all of your servos' abilities get better, and that you
Hmm.
don't purchase abilities in the match. You predefine them outside of the match.
Yeah.
So what you can't necessarily see is what an individual servo is capable of. Now you kind of can, because each part looks different. So a sniper rifle is a sniper rifle in a servo's
Hmm.
hands, and if you swap it out for a different weapon
Yeah.
outside of the match, it'll look different. And so you can kind of learn over time the rough characteristics of a weapon, but weapons can come with individual damage types, like
Hmm.
I think acid, fire, and ice. And I'm not sure if there's any more than that. And a
So it's
lot
hard to
of
account for that without experiencing it.
right, so you have to kind of interact with the servo to see what it's capable of.
Hmm.
And they have, I think, between 9 and 13 points you can modify, and many of those can come with abilities, either passive or active. So I think that's what they're going for, is they want to have the servo be the main source of uncertainty,
Hmm.
rather than, where is my opponent and what are they doing.
Hmm.
I'm not sure I agree with that. I don't know if I've played it enough to really cement how I feel. I think my instinct is to um, side with the Fog of War, but it's certainly
And
very
that,
very unique in
and
that
I
it
think this is a
removes that element.
good chance to talk a little bit about what kind of wrapping up this topic and look at like what makes an actual bad RTS design? Because some designs work in one game and some don't work in another. But are there any that don't work in any RTS? Like this is just not. This should not be in the game.
That is a good. Do you have any
Well, one
thoughts
that I
on
was
that off the
thinking
top of your head?
about
Because
that just kind of popped into my head that I'm not that it's kind of like I guess it could be good, but it could be bad. Is in Company of Heroes the manual targeting for tanks, like where you manually like you aim it. You can I think it was in Company of Heroes 1. I can't remember which expansion it was.
they've actually added that to a couple of very high-powered tanks in Company of Heroes 2. That
Like I've experienced it, I'm like, this is kind of cool, but I'm not sure if it takes away from what I'm trying to do elsewhere. And so I'm not sure if it's a good or bad design. So that would be my example. I'm not sure if it's good or bad yet.
yeah, and I think to define good or bad in this case, we have to say, does it distract or detract from the player's experience in any way?
Hmm.
And I don't know.
And
I'm way too.
not from a technical standpoint. Warcraft 1 had bad technical things that distracted from my gameplay, but that was different.
Yeah, and well, here's one, and I'm going kind of far back for this, so you'll have to forgive me. In Dune 2 and Dune 2000, and I did praise these mechanics somewhat in an article I wrote about it.
Mhm.
You had to place a concrete slab and then
Oh,
place
to
a
build,
building on
right?
top of it. Now, in Dune 2000, it was optional, which was actually interesting. If you didn't place a building on a slab, it didn't build at full health. So you could really quickly slap down buildings, but you'd either have to spend more afterwards to repair them, or they'd just be more vulnerable to attack. So I think that's kind of an interesting mechanic, but that kind of two-stage building really bugs me.
Because lots of RTS games obviously have that kind of build on top of another, something like creep in Starcraft, or I don't know what they called it in Warcraft 3 for the undead. It was creep,
Blight.
but not creep.
Blight.
Blight, that's it.
Well, that's a little different though, because you're kind of predefining your entire build area. This was for each building. Like, you don't have to
You have
build
to
a new
click on the
creep.
ground beforehand.
Right, you don't need to build a new creep tumor for every Zerg building, but you
Oh
did
wait,
have to build a new
actually,
concrete slab.
Warcraft 1 had that, where you had to build roads, and you could only build buildings
Oh
next
my
to roads.
god, you're right.
I only know that because my friend was playing through Warcraft 1 recently. I'm like, oh, roads.
I loved the building design of Warcraft 1 though.
And honestly, Warcraft 1 and Dune 2 are very similar in a lot of ways, which is good, I think, because obviously those two companies really bounced back and forth for a decade and really made each other better.
I am stealing from Three Moves Ahead here when they talked about active aggression, but I feel like active aggression really gets in its own way mechanically. I think the designers tried to be very clever when they designed the different factions' tech trees, but the tech trees are just completely arbitrary, especially for the stealth faction, the Syndicate. They basically picked buildings seemingly at random and said, you've got to build this before you can do that. And there's no logical flow in the interface that walks you through that. So, yeah. In fact, when I first started playing, I literally had to go on Twitter, and I had to ask the team how to build the super weapon, because I couldn't figure it out. And I wasn't even playing the Syndicate. I was playing what's considered the basic faction, which isn't the US, it's the European faction.
Yeah.
Kind of the post-EU faction. And there's some of these kind of arbitrary decisions that you can't work your way through logically, and you kind of have to work on the game's logic. In fact, I don't mind it in this game, but in Grey Goo, not to jump on that one too much, I've just been playing it a lot. In that game, the beta have to build a small hub before they build a medium hub, and have to build a medium hub before they build a large hub. And that makes sense in the context of the game, but if you think about it, it's like, why do you have to do that? Especially since, in Grey Goo in particular, the tech tree is very flat. You don't have the concept of really like a tier 3 unit. I mean, they have their super unit, but there are a couple of decision points like that where you have to almost be shown, because there's no way you would have figured it out logically.
And maybe just because all those classically designed, RTS, the Command and Conquers, the Starcrafts, the Warcrafts, all have such intuitive tech trees, is because you couldn't display information like tooltips by hovering over buildings and stuff like that on your cue card. And so maybe people feel like, oh, we have technology in our game better. We don't need to make things intuitive in the most obvious sense for a new person. You know what I mean?
That is an interesting point. And
I'm not sure if there's anything to it, but just in my mind, I'm like, oh, well, back then they couldn't. There wasn't in-game help as much. They had to make it intuitive, or else you wouldn't get it.
And it might not have necessarily, and I'm way maybe going out on a limb here, and I'd love to have an actual game designer to walk me through this, but it could be that with the simpler games, you had simpler logic for a tech tree. You couldn't have as many conditions for requirements. So, for instance, in Command and Conquer Tiberian Sun, basically each building required a different building. So you could just walk your way up the buildings. Oh, I built this, now I can build that. Oh, I built this, now I can build that. And oh, I built this, and now I can build that then. So it was a very deep and narrow tech tree, but you knew exactly the next thing you could build because it showed up. Oh yeah, now I can build this. And I think, especially in Grey Goo and Active Aggression, we see these. I don't know if they're trying to be clever or what, but you have these progressions that don't really make sense. Like for instance, with the human faction in Grey Goo, to build a teleporter, you have to first build an air pad. Now,
which is like,
yeah, once you build the air pad, the teleporter lights up. But it's like, if I'm not going air units, I'm never going to figure this out.
Yeah, exactly.
And I feel like with Tiberian Sun, you could accidentally, here's the Temple of Nod, I can build this now. Oh, and now I can build missiles. Sweet. So you kind of, it's more natural to stumble upon it in a game like that. And I wonder, without being able to look at the StarCraft 2 tech tree right now, if StarCraft 2 has kind of arbitrary things like that where you wouldn't necessarily know unless you'd been kind of introduced to StarCraft first.
I didn't even actually think about this until I visualized the cue cards in my mind, is they actually progress from the top left to the bottom right as this progresses. You do Command Center and then Supply Depot Barracks, then Engineering Bay and like turrets and bunkers, and then on the V, on the second, the advanced structures, you have like factories, and then Stargates, armories, and then your ghosts, and then Ghost Academy, and your fusion core at the bottom. And so it progresses a very top-down way, and it's not narrow like in some of the early Command and Conquer games, like you said, where it's 1 to 2 to 3 to 4. It's more, But another thing is when you hover over a building that's grayed out, it will tell you what you need to build it.
Yeah.
Which I guess is helpful.
So I guess that would be my easy, low-hanging fruit for just kind of not great RTS design. But
is unintuitive UI can obviously unintuitive tech trees can be very, very bad.
Right. But unfortunately, I tend to focus on, unfortunately for this conversation, I tend to focus on what I do like.
Yeah.
And kind of just breeze by.
I think if a game has a really bad mechanic, it's going to do badly. So, and we may not get the chance to play it, or may not make it out of its alpha or pre-alpha.
Yeah. Well, I can speak to mechanics that I don't like, but I wouldn't necessarily want to call them bad. Like I've never been a huge fan of how Age of Empires works. I like Age of Empires, but the whole age system, you put that in any other game, it would piss me off.
Yeah, and I didn't think about that until I replayed it for my article. And you're right. Like, can you imagine if like Company of Heroes, when the Soviets upgraded to the next, I don't remember what they're called, stages or whatever.
I think.
And it just announced it to the world, and it would be like, what? I don't want people to know that. Like, stop telling them. But like you were saying, like it ruins part of like the scouting you need.
And it's this weird bottlenecking. Here's something, and StarCraft 2 does this, so I can feel free to be vindictive against modern games.
No, you're fine.
I hate the population, the house, or the farm mechanic.
You do?
Build, for every 8 units, you've got to build that stupid
That's like a founding principle of all RTS games.
It's not, though. It is not. Think about Supreme Commander and Command and Conquer. How they gate progression is based on how many resources you can store.
That's true.
So it's all about build times, critical mass, and cost efficiency. That makes more sense to me than having to perform this arbitrary action every 4 units I want to build.
And that was actually it wasn't brought up specific. Oh, go ahead.
I'm sorry to kind of crap on Age of Active Aggression again. And I actually kind of enjoy it. I think it's fun to play, but you've got to kind of force yourself to learn it before it becomes enjoyable. But one of the hardest things to learn about active aggression for me is they force you to bank resources to tech to certain levels. So,
which is counterintuitive for a StarCraft player.
For instance, with it's for an RTS in general, very few of them force you to save up enormous sums of resources. But for the Chimera faction, I couldn't remember the name earlier, but you have to build your kind of initial tech structure, you have to bank up your maximum allowable store of the blue resource. I can't remember which one it is, but it's the blue one. You have to get 3,000 to build that structure, to be able to store more resources, to be able to build more structures. So you can't even progress down your tech tree because you can't physically store enough resources to build another building.
Mm-hmm.
So you've got to bank up all these resources, then build it, and then you can have more storage to build more buildings. I think
I
that
actually
is a
don't like that. I haven't
that is a
experienced.
legitimately bad mechanic.
Yeah, I haven't played active aggression yet, but that sounds horrible. That sounds really bad.
Yeah, that was it. Took that was one thing that took me a very, very long time to learn naturally, just trying to play it and figure it out. And I'd like to think I'm a relatively fast learner for RTS, but active aggression threw me for several loops like that, where it was just like once you figure it out, it's not so bad, but the actual act of learning it kind of biases you against the mechanic itself.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, I think those kind of arbitrary gating mechanics
Mm-hmm.
that force you to perform, especially the kind of farm, the Warcraft, the Blizzard style, where you've got to build buildings to get additional population count.
Mm-hmm.
I think.
Well, here, this will be the last topic we'll talk about on
Okay.
this before we move on to our last one.
Okay.
But you, what you bring up is point that midway through the Legacy of the Void beta for StarCraft 2, they completely removed the macro mechanics from it. They took away Mule, Chrono, and Inject. And the reason they did that is because the designers wanted to see how people would use their freed up APM. You know, because especially for Zerg, because injects are just such a massive. It's like I think probably like 10 to 15 APM a minute, or not a minute because APM, but APM.
I gotcha.
To do that, which would take away from the battle, and it started a good discussion of whether they were good design or whether they were forced mechanical tests. That the person who's better mechanically is going to be rewarded because they can do that more consistently, and whether that's good or bad. And one of the things a couple pros brought up was in a game as competitive with such a high skill ceiling as StarCraft, you need to have that mechanical check in place that other games may not need, because to help differentiate the very good from the amazing. In the same sense that like normal athletics would have. If you're not physically good enough to play football, it doesn't matter how smart you are, you're just not going to be good enough to play. And they brought up the point that if you're not mechanically good enough to master these, say, injects, you can get to a certain level, but there's a limit you can reach without breaking through your mechanical ability. And I found it interesting that they readily admitted that this mechanic wouldn't be good in other games. But they said because StarCraft is such a competitive game, especially it has that sports aspect to it, that the pros actually prefer that there is this mechanical check to prove that they're better than their competitors. And I want to hear your thoughts on that.
Okay, so I think my thoughts on that are this.
And I'm not saying I agree or disagree, but go ahead.
And unfortunately for any listeners we may have, I'm not going to do that either. I think that comes down to the difference between someone who's a professional player and someone who just wants to enjoy the game, even as a competitive exercise. So for me, I feel like I didn't enjoy having to do that. I understood.
You don't like being supply blocked all the time?
I understood the logic behind it, but I didn't enjoy having to perform that action. It wasn't inherently an enjoyable action. It was maybe mechanically satisfying if I won because I knew that I did that well, but it wasn't tactically interesting. It wasn't strategically interesting. It was just something I had to consistently do to continue. And I think so. It's not something I particularly enjoy, and at the same time, I understand where the pros are coming from. I just wonder if not in StarCraft necessarily, because I do think it actually works in the context of the game. But I wonder if there were not other ways that existed to get the same sort of mechanical bump without feeling arbitrary. And I don't have a good example of that.
And being supply blocked is one of the most gut-wrenching things in game, especially late game or like mid game when you're like at 120. And all of a sudden you see an enemy army coming, and you're like, I'm going to produce, I'm supply blocked for the next 20 seconds, and I'm just screwed. And it's just like crippling how you feel after that.
And
But at the same time, I understand like it's not fun. But at the same time, if you I don't know. I feel like be rewarding people who remember things is always nice. But I understand where you're coming from. That there could be different ways to do that.
yeah, and unfortunately, I don't have a good example of that
You can't
myself.
bring up a problem without presenting a solution. Gosh, who are you? But no, you're right, and it's one of those things like, I mean, that leads into a whole other conversation: is should everything in a game be fun, or should something just be a challenge? And that's a whole side topic. Is
Yeah,
does it have to be interesting or not? But
unfortunately, my answer would be I don't think that's even the right question in the first place. But
it should be, I think, fun. But at the same time, if everything's fun, is it hard anymore? So it's tricky.
well,
But
I think part. I mean, I wrote like a 3,000 word article on this. That in some cases the challenge is the fun.
mm-hmm,
The progress is the fun. I think what I'm talking about is an arbitrary mechanic, an arbitrary stumbling
mm-hmm,
block to actually playing the game.
mm-hmm,
It was placed there specifically and solely to increase mechanical demand. It doesn't
mm-hmm.
a mechanic that doesn't feel like a necessary part of the game. So I'm not even talking necessarily about fun. I'm talking about the way the
Yeah.
game is constructed.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
And I guess that's why it works only. Well, I mean, Warcraft 2 had it, but that's forever long ago. But in Starcraft 2, it's specifically designed to be hard. It's not meant to be an easy game. It's not meant to, you know. I guess like when a game is designed to be hard like that, they have to install things that would more mechanical checks than the average game would have. And
and
I don't know if
yeah,
that's.
I
I guess
understand
it
that. I
comes down
just
to their design philosophy.
to me, I don't see that as an interesting activity.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I I understand the need to place 18 barracks or 22 barracks over the course of the match, and
Mm-hmm.
God 35, 50, 110 supply depots. I guess personally, I don't feel like that action of placing a supply depot. I mean, you're forced to, and you're rewarded for remembering it, or you're punished for forgetting. I
Mm-hmm.
guess is the more accurate way of saying it. But so, for instance, in Company of Heroes, the original one, and I'm not even sure I like this mechanic that much. The
Mm-hmm.
more territory you controlled, the higher
Mm-hmm.
your population count was. So it
Yes.
actually encouraged you, almost forced you to go out and constantly be fighting everywhere on the map.
Mm-hmm.
Um, no, I think
Which I think was one of their. I think it was very intentional for them to do that. So, but I'm
yeah.
sure you agree that was on purpose. But
Well, one of my core thoughts about Company of Heroes versus StarCraft 2 is in StarCraft or StarCraft 1 or 2,
mm-hmm.
you start out where the only thing on the map you care about is your enemy's base. So basically
Mm-hmm.
one point on the map. And um, as the game progresses, as each player adds armies and expansions, the map opens up,
Mm-hmm.
and there are more parts of the map that kind of come into play.
Mm-hmm. And that's when you see, that's why a 30-minute game is a map usually split down the middle, and it's kind of like back and forth
Right
teetering.
now, a Company of Heroes match, 5 minutes into the game, the map is
You
split
have
down
that
the middle.
split. Yeah.
Right from the beginning, the entire map is in play in Company of Heroes, and where you move your units in the first 5 minutes of play is kind of your opening strategy. It's like, do I want
Mm-hmm.
to focus on munitions? Do I want to focus on fuel? Do I want to try to get that early victory point to get some
So knock some points off of them or something.
right up front? So in some ways, I kind of like those games, and this is way off topic. We're way off of left field here, but I really like the games where there are points on the map that specifically encourage you to continue taking territory.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
And I think that's one of the interesting is because, obviously I haven't talked to not Grey Goo Company Heroes developers, but you could see how much they looked at the traditional RTS design and said, we want to break that and still make a good game.
and
And
I think all of Relic's games have been like that because they did Homeworld.
Oh yeah, it's
as
ever
well.
since Dawn of War and things like that. So
Well, they did Homeworld, so that was like
yes.
the first RTS that was universally not the first, but it was probably the mind-blowing RTS of all time. Like of StarCraft and Warcraft 2 popularized the RTS, and the genre will forever owe them for that. But
Mhm.
like Homeworld, I remember, I think it was like out of a PC Gamer CD, like loading up a demo and just being mind boggled by, oh, whoa, I can fly spaceships straight up and down, and there's the map is this giant cube full of nothingness and asteroids, and you have this spaceship and you've got the nebula off in the skybox, and it was like, what? So, um, I
What were we
really do
talking
think
about?
I don't remember. I think we're talking about we started with bad mechanics and we ended up at Homeworld.
Oh,
So
okay.
somehow.
But yeah, and I had a thought, but I totally lost it. Probably not important. Okay, well, this was a very good discussion. Should we move on to the last topic?
Yes. Yeah. Do you want to introduce the last topic for us?
Okay, it's I believe you actually were talking with someone about this, or you were listening to a podcast, right? About how RTS games, due to the fact that they're real time, are not strategic enough.
Oh no, that was one of my Gama Sutra articles. It was in the comments section,
Oh yes,
and
which I don't know if you want to trust the comment section all the time, but Kama Sutra sometimes can be good.
well, yeah, I mean Gama Sutra is very heavily populated by people in the games industry.
Mm-hmm.
And I think the gentleman who made this comment is himself a game designer and routinely blogs on game design and
Mm-hmm.
strategy game design. So I think he's not kind of an off the wall, um, easy to dismiss comment.
Yeah.
But that comment aside, I think it brings up the larger discussion of what is depth in an RTS, what is strategy in an RTS, and why is it so common that you see bandied about that RTS games, that this game has no depth or this other game is not strategic? What do these terms specifically mean, and how can they be applied to a game? I mean, you see this about Starcraft all the time. Oh, it's not deep. Oh, the person who clicks faster wins. Um, the game has no strategy, and to me, by my definitions of strategy and depth, StarCraft 2 is a paragon example of what an RTS
Mm-hmm.
should be. In fact, not to completely derail this conversation we just
No,
started,
you're good.
but one of my philosophies for RTS game design is you take the StarCraft model, the broad mechanical description of StarCraft.
Mm-hmm.
My contention is any mechanic you take out of that model, you must replace with a mechanic of roughly equal complexity, or the game will feel boring. It won't
Mm-hmm.
be as interesting.
Yeah.
So StarCraft, in terms of depth, StarCraft offers probably the most methods to win out of any other RTS. And
Mm-hmm.
I'm gonna go out on the line there. I can't think of another RTS that gives you more ways to win. You can win, especially at the lower levels. You can win by just having a better economy. If
Mm-hmm.
I know how to use my workers better than you, I'm probably going to be an advantage. Or if I'm, for instance, playing Protoss and I get out good units and know how to use them well, I can
Mm-hmm.
win through micro.
And that's one of the great, and I agree with that, because I mean, if you look at like all the early strategies, rushes and cheeses, and then you look at all the macro late game strategies, and you kind of see that in Company Heroes too. The Company Heroes can bottleneck late game on the perfect composition, but I think the idea that the most modern RTS games, at least the good ones, like you think of your Company Heroes of 2 and your StarCraft 2 and things like that, they have multiple viable ways to win in all stages of the game.
And that, to me, basically at its essence is depth.
Mm-hmm.
Is how many options do I have at any given time, and when presented with a challenge, how many options do I have to answer that challenge? And StarCraft does that basically, I think, better than any other game, including and especially Company of Heroes 2.
Mm-hmm.
The way I look at it is basically in Company of Heroes 2, you almost always end up winning because of unit usage. How you
Mm-hmm.
use your units is far and above the most important thing. You can, over the course of a match, slowly fuel starve your opponent to the point that they can't produce tanks anymore.
Yeah.
Which is
and then people get scared, which you don't. When you can't build tanks, you're scared.
But in most cases in 1v1, it tends to be I get my anti-infantry infantry behind your your
And Company
fragile
Heroes
support
is that
weapons.
ultimate tactical style, and it's like I can use my and I don't use tactics in a bad way because I think first off, I think we probably should narrow down the difference between tactics and strategies after you're done with your thought. But go
Well,
ahead.
I think I can lead into this. So to me, Company of Heroes 2, it's very hard, if not impossible, to purely win based off of your economic um, competence, because economy is almost entirely determined by how well you handle yourself tactically. So leading from that, to me, tactics in an RTS specifically is minute by minute, second by second control over individual units. Not even groups of units, but individual units or models, if we want to
Hmm.
use the traditional gaming terms. So that's entirely divorced, in my mind at least, from economics.
Hmm.
And mechanically, strategy is effectively your long-term plan, which ideally you'd want to be able to pick from a fairly large
Hmm.
number of um, different end game scenario states, and then kind of mechanically that would be the economic decisions you would make to support that. And I don't think that strategy is purely economic. I think in RTS, the main strategic decisions that you make are economic, whereas tactical decisions are more logistical and then micro. So that's how I personally break it up. And depth is the number of options you have in both of those arenas.
I agree with that, and it's just like that's one of the things is you need to separate depth and complexity from the overarching strategy or tactics. Because something can be tactical but also have great depth.
Well, and I think part of the disconnect comes in where a lot of people will maybe be military history buffs, and they'll be using a more militaristic definition of strategy, which doesn't necessarily line up to what is effectively a real-time board game. I mean,
Hmm.
RTS rules are derived in a large part from games like Stratego and Warhammer 40K. Um, so there is a level of simulation that I think RTS don't have. I was looking at Gary Grigsby's War in the East today from a Twitter conversation I was having, and when you compare the modeling that they did in that game with what you see in an RTS, there's RTS aren't intended and don't represent reality. They're not trying to do that. That's not the point of an RTS. No more than chess is trying to represent reality.
Hmm.
And I think
So I
some
think
people.
Company Heroes does a pretty good job. Just to be fair, Company Heroes is an amazing game.
Well, and I agree, but I think.
But no, yeah, I agree with
Well, and
your point
and well,
though
I'm
that
not.
it's not meant to be a reality simulator.
I'm not even sure I would agree. I think Company of Heroes is trying to model war games specifically,
Okay.
not reality. I think, and you see this with Dawn of War and Dawn of War 2. They very elegantly translate the turn-based Warhammer 40K into the computer, the real-time space.
Hmm.
But I think if you're trying to model reality, you would want to look something more like Blitzkrieg or Men of War. Um, Men of War or Man of War? Men of War. Where units have individual ammo and they have inventories, and how much gear they have impacts how fast they move and how quickly they become fatigued. Company of
Hmm.
Heroes doesn't have any of that because it wouldn't be interesting.
Hmm.
Company of Heroes kind of took the Occam's razor to war game design, and they cut out anything that wasn't. They didn't feel like it was an interesting
Hmm.
mechanic. Now, personally, I like fuel and ammo management, but I'm insane, so.
You're a little bit of a crazy person. But yeah, and that's what it comes down to is I guess if we nail down strategy as having overarching plans and how you execute them, I don't think that person has any point at all because I understand something like StarCraft is a very APM heavy game. But at the same time you can win by just having the better strategy, by having the better composition. And some people don't like that. Some people prefer that you win purely by clicking. Other people prefer you win by your decision making. and both are actually very viable. That's the great thing about games like Starcraft. Um, and that's one of the things to me that confuses me is people thinking that there's no decision making in the long term for a game like Starcraft or Company of Heroes, where it's very adaptive. You can go in saying, "This is what I want to do in the first 5 minutes," but after that, anything goes. You could go up against someone who's rushing you, and you're not prepared for that, so you have to adapt. Or someone rushes for tanks in Company of Heroes, and you have to. That flexibility and that adjustment is kind of the epitome of strategy to me.
You
And
know,
that you go
you know
ahead.
what we need to do
Hmm.
is I almost want to table this conversation for now and find someone on the other side of this to actually have a conversation with, because I have the feeling that you and I have this a very similar outlook on what an RTS is supposed to be,
Hmm.
and we're
We're too close in our thoughts.
well, I don't know if we're accurately representing what these people think, and I
Good
don't want to
point.
use
Because it's one
these people
comment or two, right?
pejoratively.
So.
Well, no, but you see this all the time on RTS forums, especially those that aren't specifically related to StarCraft, where StarCraft comes up.
Hmm.
It becomes a very common thing. It's, oh, StarCraft is all who clicks faster.
Hmm.
And I think that you and I almost fall more on the MOBA side of not
Oh,
that
whoa.
we like MOBAs,
Oh.
but that the reason we play games is more the reason that MOBA players play games. It's very much about the competition. It's very much about the mechanical precision. It's very much about um, the competition. Where I think where you would see people more espousing the other side is people that would tend to play more grand strategy in 4X games, where
Hmm.
it's very much about patience and very long-term planning, which RTS tend to not have. And I'm not talking about planning out a 30-minute match. I'm talking about planning out 4 to 10 hours of campaign play where you've got a 1,000-item tech tree that you've got to sift your way through.
And to be fair,
Um,
I'm a huge fan of the Total War games, so I can kind of bring that side to it. And in that sense, I guess there are scales to strategy. Maybe is what I would say to that response, because like say the Total War, the Civilization games, or what is it, King's Crusader games, or is that what they're called? There's a one
Crusader Kings.
Crusader Kings. Yes, I haven't played them, but they're along that line of game are obviously grand. Like you said, they're grand strategies. I mean, I probably sunk about 100 hours into Rome Total War. So like when in the early 2000s, just because you plan out for hours and hours and hours, and so I can understand where they're coming from in the sense that a StarCraft match is 30 minutes or less, and so therefore you don't have those grand plans. You don't build up your army in the same fashion. You don't have to plan out. Well, no, even when I think about it like that, it's just shrunken down. In a Total War game or any other of that style, you plan out your attack routes, and you have to wait turns to do it. In StarCraft, you plan out your attack routes, and you do it in seconds. And so I think it's exactly the same, just on a shorter time limit. And
Well, I think in a
maybe that's where they get frustrated.
I think in some cases it's a
Go
matter
ahead.
of scale. I think that's one reason you see Supreme Commander being so popular is you can actually kind of have fronts. I've got 500 tanks over
Yeah.
here and 200 aircraft somewhere else on the map, and I think you don't get as much logistics in a game like StarCraft where you can cross the map in 5 seconds. I'm
Hmm.
exaggerating slightly for effect, but more.
No, boosted mid-evac works. It
But I
works.
mean, 20 seconds, for an army. Protoss army
Mm.
can probably cross the map in 20 or 30 seconds maximum. Um, so logistics almost doesn't matter. There's no real concept of logistics in a game like StarCraft, where you've got, being out of position happens in StarCraft, but it's not like, I've got my army at the north corner of the map and they attack at the south corner, and oh well, there goes my south corner. Um, so I think that may be part of it, where you don't really have the concept of a theater of war or a front, um, and that's actually something.
Well, actually, something.
Well, no, I am oversimplifying
No,
StarCraft
no,
a
and
little
I
bit
actually
because
have
of
an
the
idea I want to kind of bring up about that. Did you really pay attention to the StarCraft pro scene during the Swarm host era?
maybe right at the beginning of it.
because it was a very game of attrition, and it was all about very fronts heavy. Because what it would be is it was it was TVZ Terran versus Zerg, and Zerg would go Swarm Host so they could expand because Swarm Host, for those who don't play Starcraft, would burrow and send out endless waves of free units that were weak and timed, but they would do a lot of damage if they were ignored. And so what the Terrans would do is they would just siege up against the Zergs and stop the Zerg from expanding. And then they would consistently, who could ever make the most cost-efficient trade would eventually win. Because the Zerg would be getting free units to try to push back the siege, and the Terran would just be sieging, trying to starve out the Zerg. And so it was very, and on most StarCraft maps you have your main base and your expansion, and then your third base. And third base is obviously very, very important. And so the Zerg would have to plan out where they were going to plant their swarm hosts, and plan out where they're going to, go their anti-air. And it was very, you had 3-hour games of StarCraft 2, which is outlandish. You'd never have games that long. And it was all because it was all about the tiniest positioning, all about the planning, all about looking for cracks in this. It was pretty much a wall. And I think in that sense, it could be, I would recommend you go watch some Swarm Host games if you can.
I'm gonna take a look, because that actually.
And they were very boring for StarCraft fans, because a 3-hour game in StarCraft is, you never have that. Right. But in the sense that it was very about cracks, it was very about positioning, it was very about planning, and about sieging and defending a siege.
It sounds a lot more like a Company of Heroes 2 match, where you've got those tank clusters that, you don't want to get a tank out of line unless the tank destroyer or a tiger or something come.
Exactly.
Snipe it.
And they were frustrating for StarCraft because you hate that as a StarCraft fan. But as an RTS person, I never thought about it until right now. I might have to go watch some myself to kind of look at it from a different perspective, as maybe this is more strategic in the sense that these grand strategy players would view it.
Something I would encourage you, I don't know if you've watched it before, but Wargame, any of the Wargame games are very much kind of like that too.
I've played the first one. I haven't played any of the expansions.
I love those games mechanically. I am absolutely in love with them. I love almost every high-level mechanical decision they made. I can't stand playing them, unfortunately, because there's too much very minusculely different data to sift through, because there are so many units and they're all more or less kind of the same in their category. You just have very slight differences, at least to me as an outsider. But the idea of having units have line of sight but not displaying that to the player can make matches very tense, because you're like, oh, is there somebody in that tree line that's going to take me out that I just can't see? Or is there someone right over this hill that I can't see? So scouting becomes very intense and very important, because you just don't know what you don't know. And then, of course, vehicles all have fuel and ammunition. So you can have tanks rolling around with no ammo because they've used it up in a previous fight, and they're using their machine gun trying to hit other tanks with. So I don't know. I think the sorts of considerations that come from that, like, okay, how am I going to get my tanks out here and then back safely without having them break down? Or, how can I go take this corner of the map without my units running out of ammo? Or, you don't. I think these may be the sorts of considerations that these players may be wanting to make, but I don't know. And I'd love to talk this through with someone who does hold that mindset. What do you look for in a game, and why? And maybe talk through some of these specific complaints, if they have them, about something like Starcraft or Company of Heroes.
And I think that'd be very good. I do want to discuss real fast before we wrap up the idea that
we do need to wrap up soon, because it is 1 a.m. for me, and I have to get up at 6. So
okay, that's fine. So what were you gonna say? Sorry, finish your thought.
No, I am done. You go ahead.
I just really wanted to make a point that I feel too often the idea that real-time tactical games have no depth because they don't have strategy, and to me that's just a real frustrating thought. So this is gonna be a quick rant. When you look at something like World in Conflict or Company of Heroes, which it's not RTS, but it's mostly about positioning and tactics. That the idea that because they don't have an overarching say, like resource system, and they don't have long-term planning, that they're shallow is, I think, incredibly inaccurate, especially for those two games, those two genres, um, because both of them are extremely deep in terms of how you work with your teammates or what you pick out in each for your army composition is incredibly deep and complex. And if you look at like World and Compact especially, because you have to work with your teammates who have different duties than you, the idea that there's not much there or they're shallow is kind of a frustrating thought to me because of how complex they actually are. Because they may not be click fests and they may not have macro to them, but there's a lot of depth to those games. So that's just kind of my last little rant.
Well, and I'd like to take a moment to respond because I do have some thoughts about that. So for me, it all comes back to the number of ways you have to be successful.
Mm-hmm.
So and I've not played a lot of World and Conflict, but what a lot of tactical games seem to be to me is, and there aren't a lot of tactical games.
No, they're very rare.
Even the good ones, I find frustrating at times because the only metric that you can be measured by is basically positioning and efficiency. Where, so in, we kind of talked about this before, where in Company of Heroes, you can theoretically win economically, maybe by starving out fuel, and you do have the possibility of winning through effectively being defensive, where you kind of capture 2 or all 3 victory points and kind of wait out the clock. But in reality, mostly it comes down to how well you use your units and what units you build. If you start falling behind in one of those metrics, there's no other way you can really turn around and come back and win. It does happen in close matches where 2 players will come down to the last 5 victory points on each side, or tokens, or whatever you want to call them.
Yeah.
But in most games, what ends up happening is one player gets a fairly substantial win against the other player, and the other player just doesn't have the resources.
It snowballs out of control.
Right. So my frustration, and I love tactics games. They're my favorite genre, or subgenre of RTS. It's hands down. My frustration is that when compared to a game like Starcraft, and we talked about this earlier, is Starcraft gives you so many ways to be successful, especially as a lower level player. Where a game like Company of Heroes, basically, you just have to be better than the other person at this one or these 1 or 2 things. So what I would love to see in a tactics game, and I think World in Conflict may have been on the right track here with their separation of roles and responsibilities, is if I want to be a support player and I can shine in that one aspect, where our whole team has to work together in these 2 or 3 different roles to function as a single unit. And I mean unit as team, not as like an RTS unit.
Yeah.
Although it would be really funny to make a game mode where 2 people controlled the same unit. I would like to see that.
that would be, actually, I would laugh pretty hard at that.
But I just feel like there needs to be some other way to impact the game in a tactics game. And I don't have a good solid answer for what that would be. And I think,
well, and it's probably why there's so few games, because it's very hard to be inventive and also make a good quality game.
Right. Well, and I think Company of Heroes, the reason they have the victory points is because just a slugfest between the 2 armies would be, and I know some people play that with the Annihilation game mode, but it would be painful. So you have to have that extra way to win. But it would be really interesting to see some sort of meta level to that, where you can actually have a unit that maybe impacts victory points in some way, or some sort of additional mechanic for messing with your enemy's victory point gain. Let's say they have 2 of the victory points, and you can capture this other point that temporarily stops their victory point gain, so you have a chance to come back. Now, I know Company of Heroes 2 matches tend to be very long anyway, so other things about the game would have to be redesigned to make that work. But I just feel like Um, the reason that Starcraft is so broadly popular is that the macro players can macro and the micro players can micro.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of players will do a little bit of both, and you can be successful in the very short-term game and in the very long-term game and in the mid-game. And all factions tend to have a variety of ways to approach those things. And I think what's harder in a tactics game that doesn't have that whole half of the RTS experience,
Mm-hmm.
and that whole half of the leverage you can have in an RTS over a tactics game, is you don't have the toolbox. You've got a hammer, and every problem becomes something you have to hit with a hammer.
Mm-hmm.
I think
it's all about your accuracy with that hammer.
Right. So where Starcraft, maybe it's a Swiss Army knife, and no individual tool is as fully functional as what you might see in a tactics game or some other genre. At least you have all of those options, and all of them are more or less useful when used correctly.
And a closing thought on that, it's probably also why tactics games don't sell real well. I mean, I don't know. Starcraft 2, each of their expansions sold like 1 million in the first day. I'm trying to see how many World and Conflict sold total, but I imagine it was probably 1 or 2 million over the course of its entire, lifespan. And it could have been because it was such a narrow focus,
Yeah, and again, I have no answer there. It's just
I do think more specialized games are more specialized niche, and when you're already a niche of a niche, or however you pronounce it, but if you're a subgroup of a subgroup, you're starting to get to a small size.
That's one thing I like so much about AirMech is I feel like they changed the StarCraft model of RTS successfully. You have everything you do is funneled through your AirMech, and you don't really build buildings. You just kind of pop these little add-ons to your pre-existing bases that you can capture. But the fact that you have to build units and move them around and capture the bases and harass your enemy, it has so many things that you can and have to do that it never really feels boring. It always feels fresh, and you have this interesting aspect where you bring your loadout of units and turrets with you. So do I want to bring in the artillery into combat, or do I want to bring in this healing unit? And I think part of the reason the game never took off is it feels kind of skeezy almost, and I hate to say that. I like AirMech, but where maybe player A wins because he has unlocked a unit that player B doesn't have. But I mean, technically, how AirMech have used that model, I've talked to them about this. How Carbon Games use the model is they see the free to play as basically a demo. They feel like if you want to get the full competitive experience, you pay, I think, $10 or $20. You unlock their premium tier, and you get everything all at once.
Mm-hmm.
So then you don't have to grind. You can, but you don't have to grind your way up through the free to play model. And then at that point, the only things you have to earn are cosmetics. So I think that's how they view it. But it's not a particularly popular game, which kind of makes me sad because it's based on, and I'm again way out in the limb here, way down the rabbit trail here, but it's based on Herzog Zwei, which I think was made in 1987, so that would have been 2 years after I was born. And that was by some considered to be the first true RTS. It was made even, I think, before Dune 2. I think that came out in 1992 or 1993. So it's got this remarkable lineage behind it, and to me at least, it's such a well-realized concept that has the mechanical demands that you would look for from a StarCraft, and it has the ability to work as a team or in a solo game mode because of the different air mechs having different characteristics, and you can kind of build your army. I do think in those build your army type games, there are a couple of them, and not build your army because that's a little misleading. Choose your forces, choose your loadout. Like Company of Heroes has a version of that with their commanders. And Company of Heroes, I think, kind of gets it, because you can bring 3, but you can only pick 1.
Mm-hmm.
And to me, if I were designing that system, I'd say you can only pick 1, but maybe you can sell the commander back and get a different one. Now, it's not elegant, and there's some potential issues like I get this commander, I get the best unit from that commander, sell it, and get a new commander. But to me, that sort of freedom to, you're predefining StarCraft. In StarCraft, all that matters is the match. In Company of Heroes, it kind of matters what you bring into the match, and it really matters which commander you pick. And there's no getting around that.
Well, actually, I was thinking about, would that add strategy? Would that, in the sense that these other people are talking about, would that be added strategy? Because it's an overarching thing.
It would, but it would also be far more difficult to balance.
Mm-hmm.
If I can.
Well, I'm not saying good or bad. I'm just saying, would that fill the strategy requirement that those certain people were thinking? I wonder.
I'm not sure. Yeah, I'm not sure if outside like meta match level items or objects would fulfill that in any way.
Sorry, just let's wrap up your thoughts. I know it's late for you.
So yeah, my final thought regarding games, and there are some of them coming out. There's one called Tooth and Tail, a small budget
I saw a preview
RTS,
for that. Yeah,
where you kind of pick your units and you bring them in. That's your faction. And Day9's Atlas, which is kind of seems like a MOBA RTS sort of thing. It sounds like you can pick either your heroes or your units, and of course Servo, you design your heroes outside of combat. To me, if I were to design something like that, and I think the mod I'm working on, Remnants, has some resemblance, has a mechanic that's kind of similar to that in some ways. I would want the player to be able to either, like, let's say you can pick 2 commanders in Company of Heroes 2. So I pick one at the beginning of the match, realize that they've counterpicked me, and then I pick another one that maybe covers for the weaknesses of the first commander that I picked. Or in Air Mech, if I pick a bad loadout, maybe I get 1 or 2 chances to change my loadout, or I can swap out individual units on the fly if I need to. So just to kind of diminish the impact of that pre-picking. I mean, Dota has kind of embraced that with like Captain's Mode, where half of the match is outside of the match, and they're like, screw it, you've made your picks, you've made your bans, and that's what you get. And a bad composition can lose you the game. But to me, I want to see a little bit of forgiveness for the player, a little bit of adaptability, especially if you're being forced to pick things prior to the match even starting. So that's the end of that long-winded rambling thought. But yeah, unfortunately, it is 11 after 1 a.m. I really need to go to sleep. I've had a fascinating conversation, and I look forward to any comments anyone has once this goes up on YouTube about what did we talk about? We talked about what is depth, bad mechanics versus unsuitable mechanics. What else did we talk about? Help me out, Toph.
What did we start with? We were talking about Grey Goo versus StarCraft in terms of... What were we talking about?
You have the outline.
I can't remember. If you listen to the show, you know what it was about.
I was just trying to wrap it up. Trying to do a little wrap-up bit. Next time we'll have an outline, and we'll be able to do a proper wrap-up segment. But yeah, any thoughts anyone had, I would love to hear them. And if anyone out there feels like, for instance, StarCraft is not a deep game, it feels like they can adequately articulate that. We don't want to attack you. We want to understand your position and maybe be illuminated ourselves.
Yes.
So we're 2 people, and we'd love to have an outside opinion on this if anyone's interested in coming on and talking about different ideas about strategy and depth and why the current RTS model maybe doesn't fulfill them. But Toph, thanks for your. Can I say Toph or just should I do Topher?
Whatever you feel comfortable with.
Okay, I don't know. I tend to shorten things when I can, so. But yeah, no, whatever you want me to call you, I'm fine with.
Yeah. And
Thank you so much for the
thanks,
conversation.
thanks for
I had a
talking.
great time. I think you'll like the image I chose for the talk. I think it's from one of the Starcraft 2 missions. It's one of those Protoss um, world ships, or I don't know what it's called, but the neat little Protoss ship in front of a planet
Oh yeah.
from one of the match loading screens. So I think maybe each episode, if we make this a regular thing, I'll pick random art from a random RTS. We'll go back to Command and Conquer 2, and we'll go to maybe some less popular RTS. Maybe have a little guess if I can pick some really obscure ones. See if you can guess what
Force
they
them
were
to
from.
figure it out.
Yeah, or maybe like not just the game, but where in the game it's from.
Well, I gotta let you go. You need to get to sleep, man.
All right. Well, thanks so much. You have a great evening.
No problem. That was fun. Thank you.
Yep. Bye.